World War II, The Real Story. A documentary script. September 1, 1939. Before dawn, German tanks roll across the Polish border. Within hours, bombs are falling on Warsaw. Within 2 days, the world's two most powerful colonial empires, Britain and France, declare war on Germany. It is the beginning of the deadliest conflict in human history. Before it ends 6 years later, more than 70 million people will be dead, cities will be reduced to ash, and the world will never be the same again. But this war did not begin on September 1, 1939. Its roots go back 2 decades earlier to the ashes of a different war, one that was supposed to end all wars. This is the real story of how World War II happened. To understand World War II, we have to go back to 1918, the final year of World War I. That war had killed nearly 17 million people. When it finally ended, the victorious powers, Britain, France, and the United States, gathered in a palace outside Paris to decide the fate of the defeated nations. The result was the Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919, and it was, in many ways, a document built on revenge rather than peace. Germany was forced to accept full blame for the war under the infamous War Guilt Clause. It had to pay enormous financial reparations, an amount so large that Germany would still be paying it off nearly a century later. Its army was slashed to a fraction of its former size, it lost territory, it lost colonies, it lost pride. For the German people, this was not justice, it was humiliation. Imagine a nation forced to its knees, blamed entirely for a catastrophe it did not cause alone, crushed under debt it could never realistically repay. This is the environment in which resentment grows, and resentment left unchecked becomes fuel for extremism. Economist John Maynard Keynes, who attended the Paris talks, warned at the time that the treaty was too harsh, that it would create economic chaos and eventually another war. Few listened to him then. History would prove him right. Germany in the 1920s was a nation in crisis. Hyperinflation destroyed the value of its currency so completely that people needed wheelbarrows full of cash just to buy bread. Unemployment soared. The young democratic government, known as the Weimar Republic, struggled to keep control. Then, in 1929, disaster struck the entire world. The Great Depression, triggered by the collapse of the American stock market, spread across the globe. Germany, already fragile, was hit harder than almost anywhere else. By 1932, nearly 1 in every 3 German workers was unemployed. Desperate people look for someone who promises answers. And in this atmosphere of fear and anger, one man rose with a message the German people were ready to hear. His name was Adolf Hitler. Hitler was the leader of the National Socialist German Workers' Party, the Nazis. His message was simple and seductive. Germany had been betrayed. Its humiliation was not its own fault, but the fault of others, foreign powers, political enemies, and in his twisted ideology, the Jewish people, whom he blamed for Germany's misfortunes. He promised to restore German pride. He promised jobs. He promised to tear up the Treaty of Versailles and make Germany a great power once again. In January 1933, Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany. Within months, he had dismantled democracy itself, banning opposition parties, controlling the press, and establishing a dictatorship. By 1934, he held absolute power as Führer, leader of Germany. And he began to prepare for war. Hitler's ambitions were built on an idea he called Lebensraum, living space. He believed the German people needed more territory to expand into, largely at the expense of Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. This wasn't a secret ambition. He had written about it openly years earlier in his book Mein Kampf. Starting in the mid-1930s, Hitler began breaking the Treaty of Versailles piece by piece. He rebuilt Germany's military, a direct violation of the treaty. In 1936, he sent troops into the Rhineland, a demilitarized zone bordering France. In 1938, he annexed Austria in what was called the Anschluss. Later that same year, he demanded and received a portion of Czechoslovakia known as the Sudetenland. And here is where the world made a critical mistake. Britain and France, still scarred by the horrors of World War I, desperately wanted to avoid another conflict. So instead of confronting Hitler, they adopted a policy known as appeasement, giving in to his demands, hoping that each concession would be his last. At the Munich conference in September 1938, British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain returned home holding a piece of paper signed by Hitler, declaring he had secured peace for our time. He was wrong. Just 6 months later, Hitler broke his promise and seized the rest of Czechoslovakia. Appeasement had not stopped him, it had only convinced him that the West would not fight. By 1939, Hitler had set his sights on Poland. To protect himself from a two-front war, he made a stunning and cynical move, a non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union, his ideological enemy. Secretly, the pact included a plan to divide Poland between Germany and the USSR. With his eastern flank secured, Hitler was free to act. On September 1, 1939, German forces invaded Poland using a devastating new military tactic called Blitzkrieg, lightning war, combining fast-moving tanks, motorized infantry, and air power to overwhelm defenders before they could organize a response. Britain and France had promised to defend Poland's independence. On September 3, 1939, both nations declared war on Germany. World War II had begun. But Europe was not the only theater of conflict. On the other side of the globe, Japan had its own ambitions of empire. Since the early 1930s, Japan had been expanding aggressively across Asia, invading Manchuria in 1931 and launching a full-scale war against China in 1937, a war marked by brutal atrocities including the infamous Nanjing Massacre. Japan sought to dominate the Pacific and secure the natural resources, oil, rubber, and metal, that its growing military needed. Germany, Italy, and Japan formed an alliance known as the Axis powers, bound by shared ambitions of territorial expansion and a common opposition to the existing world order. For the first 2 years of the war, the Axis powers seemed unstoppable. Germany conquered Poland, then swept through Denmark, Norway, Belgium, the Netherlands, and in a shocking 6-week campaign, France itself in 1940. Britain stood alone, surviving relentless bombing during the Battle of Britain. Then, in June 1941, Hitler made what would become one of the greatest strategic blunders in military history. He broke his pact with the Soviet Union and launched Operation Barbarossa, a massive invasion of the USSR. It opened a brutal Eastern Front that would eventually consume millions of soldiers on both sides and ultimately drain Germany's strength beyond recovery. For over 2 years, the United States remained officially neutral, though it supported Britain with supplies and equipment. That changed on the morning of December 7, 1941, when Japanese forces launched a surprise attack on the American naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, destroying much of the U.S. Pacific Fleet and killing more than 2,000 people. The very next day, the United States declared war on Japan. Days later, Germany and Italy, honoring their alliance with Japan, declared war on the United States. The conflict was now truly global. Every major power in the world was drawn into the fight. By 1942 and 1943, the momentum began to shift. In North Africa, Allied forces pushed back German and Italian troops. On the Eastern Front, the brutal Battle of Stalingrad ended in a catastrophic defeat for Germany, marking the beginning of a long Soviet counteroffensive that would eventually reach Berlin. In the Pacific, American forces began pushing back Japanese expansion island by island, in some of the bloodiest fighting of the entire war. Then, on June 6, 1944, known forever as D-Day, Allied forces launched the largest seaborne invasion in history, landing on the beaches of Normandy, France. It opened a new front in Western Europe and marked the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. As Allied forces advanced into German territory in 1945, they uncovered something the world was not fully prepared to comprehend: the concentration and extermination camps of the Holocaust. Under Hitler's regime, 6 million Jewish people, along with millions of others, Roma people, disabled individuals, political prisoners, and more, had been systematically murdered in one of history's greatest crimes against humanity. In April 1945, as Soviet forces closed in on Berlin, Adolf Hitler took his own life in his underground bunker. Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945, a day now remembered as VE Day, victory in Europe. But the war was not yet over. Japan continued fighting in the Pacific. To force a swift end to the conflict and avoid a costly invasion of the Japanese mainland, the United States dropped atomic bombs on the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945, an act that remains one of the most debated decisions in modern history. On September 2, 1945, Japan formally surrendered. World War II was finally over. When the guns finally fell silent, the world had lost more than 70 million lives. Entire cities lay in ruins, empires had collapsed, and a new global order was emerging from the wreckage, one defined by two rising superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, whose rivalry would soon give birth to a new kind of conflict, the Cold War. But perhaps the most important lesson of World War II is this: it did not begin with tanks or bombs. It began with humiliation, economic collapse, unchecked hatred, and a world too hesitant to confront danger when it could still have been stopped. It is a story the world has never been allowed to forget.